Well, welcome everyone to the latest edition of Stories for Healing. I want to welcome you all as we move into December now, and still more stories coming from around the world. It's hard to realize that this is a project that started at the end of October, and now we're still going strong. And the good news is we've got lots of storytellers ready to tell. We've got lots of people ready to hear. There's still a need. There's still the stress and the antipathy and the division that these stories are all trying to address. Not by saying I'm right and you're wrong, or this is good and you're bad, but by talking about healing and reconciliation, about transformation and growth. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Today, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce a special storyteller for us all, Milbre Burch. Milbre, would you please tell us a story?
Happily, Jim, and thank you for inviting me to do so. I want to share three little stories. Two personal stories will bookend a folk tale. The two personal stories are about my children, and certainly having children at midlife was one of the revelatory experiences of my life. In 2001, my family lived in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My daughter, Katie, was 9 years old, and her little sister Elizabeth was 5. They went to the Montessori Community School nearby, and it was my habit to pick one of my two daughters up on Tuesday and leave the other in daycare for a while to have a mommy day with the one. And then on Thursday, I would go back to the school and leave the other child in daycare for a while and have a mommy day with the second. As it happened, September 11th, 2001 came on a mommy day. That morning, my children were at school already when my husband came to me to say that he'd just seen online an airline flown into one of the twin towers at the World Trade Center. He came back out of his office to tell me moments later that a second plane had flown into the second tower. And we held each other as we began to understand what was happening all around us. And we stayed close to one another all that day long. We received an email from the school saying that the teachers would refrain from talking about what had happened during the day to give families a chance to talk about it that night. But on the following day, they would be answering any questions that came up among the children in class. Because I was loath to leave my husband Berkeley's side, I took him with me to go and pick up my younger daughter for our mommy day. Now, Elizabeth doesn't like surprises, and she was very perplexed that her dad was in the car on this day. We drove to the local mall to get some ice cream together. And as we were standing in line, she looked up at me and said, "Mommy, I don't know what Daddy's doing here. What's Daddy doing on a mommy day?" And I said, "Well, honey, something really bad and sad happened today. There were some bad guys and bullies who hurt a lot of people. And Daddy and I wanted to stay together, and so he's with us now." And she accepted that. After we finished our ice cream, we went back to the school to pick up her big sister, Katie, and Elizabeth ran into the late day room and said, "Katie Blake, some bad guys and bullies hurt a bunch of people," and we herded her out with her sister. And on the way home, we began to talk in more detail about what had happened that day. Who knows what children make of these things? Well, the new year rolled round, and on January 1st, we set out in the car to drive from Chapel Hill out to Pittsburgh to visit Clapping Hens Farm, which is the home of our friends, Louise and Holmes. Now, Louise is Japanese Jewish, which meant that she's already a multicultural experience all to herself. They were having an open house with latkes and sushi, and they were introducing the baby they had just adopted, a little boy of color, to their community. We were so eager to go and welcome this child into our world. We visited that afternoon with the new family, and then we got back in our car and we started to drive down the road to go back home. And we passed the mailbox at the end of Louise's driveway. It said Clapping Hens Farm on it, and all over the mailbox there were different colors of handprints. And Elizabeth, seeing that as we turned down the road, said from the back seat, "Idea, idea, idea." I said, "What is it, Elizabeth?" She said, we could paint our mailbox like all the peoples of the world. I said, okay. She said, then we could paint our house like all the pieces of people of the world. I said, uh-huh. And she said, then we could get clothes and we could dress like all the peoples of the world. I said, yes. And she said, that way, no harm would ever come to us. And there was a moment of silence. And then she said, even the bad guys and the bullies can be on the mailboxes. May it be so, Elizabeth. May it be so. This next tale comes from Zimbabwe. It's called A Blind Man Catches a Bird. Once there was a young man who was an incredibly talented hunter. He came to marry a young woman in another village and went to live with her and her people. And on that day, he met his brother-in-law for the first time, a young man about his age who was a blind seer. The two young men began to talk, and in the days that passed between them, they began to form a friendship, for each of them had incredible skill, and they were eager to share in the skills of the other. And so one day, the blind seer said, I would go with you into the forest when you go hunting. I have been in the forest many times, but I have never gone there to trap birds the way you have talked about trapping birds. Come with me then, said the hunter. And the two of them walked along together, side by side, the hand of the blind man on the shoulder of the hunter. But what was astonishing to the young man who was in the lead was the acuity of his brother-in-law's hearing. For the blind man would say, listen, a warthog is climbing out of its bed and about to cross the path, and here came an animal, just as he'd said. Or he would say, shh, a bird is unfolding its wings and will fly above us shortly, and that bird came over their heads. And so the hunter was astonished at this incredible skill his brother-in-law had. At last they came to a clearing surrounding a small pond, and that's where the hunter said they should set their traps. He put his down and he began to cover it the way he always did so that it could not easily be seen. He had handed a second trap to his brother-in-law, and the man set it down by the water, and he covered it over as best he could, but still you could see it. The hunter didn't think it would matter. And the two walked back out of the forest together. The next morning, they went together to find what their skill had been in trapping birds the day before. And even before they reached that place, the blind man said, listen, we have both caught a bird. And it was true. Both of the traps had been sprung. Now the hunter bent down first to his own trap. He opened it up, and inside was a fine, fat, plump, brown bird. It would make a good stew. He put it into the pouch at his side, and then he went to the trap belonging to his brother-in-law, and he opened it up, and in it he found a beautiful bird with feathers that looked as though it had flown through a rainbow and caught every color. He hesitated for a moment. And then he reached into the pouch and he took out the brown bird and he put the rainbow-colored bird into his own bag. And then he placed the brown bird into the hands of his blind brother-in-law, who felt the bird over, took a deep breath, and placed it within the pouch at his side. The two of them began to walk back through the forest, but the day was hot, even in the understory of the forest, and so they stopped to talk. And they exchanged ideas about many things until at last the hunter said to the seer, I have always wondered why it is that men fight with one another. Can you tell me? And the blind man turned his face as though he were looking into the hunter's eyes and even more deeply into his soul. And he said, men fight one another because they do to one another what you did to me back at the pond. And the hunter was taken aback. He felt ashamed. He was unsure what to do, and at last he opened his pouch and took out the rainbow-colored bird. And he placed it in the hands of his brother-in-law. He took the brown bird from his brother-in-law's pouch and put it into his own. And then, feeling great humility, he said, "Can you tell me then, with your wisdom, how it is that after men have fought with one another, that they learn how to come back together?" And again, the blind man turned his face as though to look into the eyes of the hunter and beyond his eyes into his soul. And the blind man said, "When men have fought, they come back together again by doing for each other what you have just done for me now." The last story I want to share with you also took place in Chapel Hill a year later than the one I began with. It was Thanksgiving time, and I was going to load my girls up into the car and drive across North Carolina to the mountains of North Georgia and there meet my brother and his family for Thanksgiving. My husband, Berkeley, was coming along in a few days. He was working on his dissertation and could use a day or two to himself before joining us. Well, whenever we went on a trip when the kids were small, we always put songs or stories on the player so that we could sing or listen together. Today, I had put on the album, I'm Gonna Let It Shine, an album Bill Harley produced of freedom songs from the civil rights movement in America. This is an a cappella album, and I defy you not to sing the songs along with the singers on the recording. So my children and I were singing with gusto as we rode down the road. I'm a Georgia girl, married to a Mississippi boy, and the two of us grew up in the Jim Crow era of the racially segregated South. My children were born into a very different world. So when they heard a verse about, if you miss me at the back of the bus, you can't find me nowhere, coming up at the front of the bus, I'll be sitting right there. They said, "Mom, what's that mean?" And I turned off the recording and we talked about what life was like when their father and I had grown up. They said, "Oh." Turned the recording on and we rode down the road singing, and then we heard someone say something about, "I'm gonna go your bail." They said, "Mom, what's that mean?" And I told them how if you do a civil disobedience, you might be arrested and put in jail, and your friends gather the money to bail you out so you can go back to standing up for what's right. And they said, "Oh," and we drove on. We got to where we were going, and a day or two later, their father joined us, and we had a celebration, and then we came home. Now it was early December. It got dark at 4:30 or 5 o'clock. We were sitting at the dinner table. It was a Thursday night, and I realized that tomorrow, on Friday, Elizabeth, who was now 6, was supposed to go home with another child for a birthday party, and we hadn't gotten a present yet. I said to her, "Honey, right after dinner, let's get in the car and go to the mall to the bookstore, and let's get a gift card for the birthday girl so that you can have a really good present to give to your friend." And she said, "Okay, Mom." So we went and we did just that. A gift card for a book is one of our favorite gifts to give or to get. And we walked back to the car in the darkness. And as I put Elizabeth in the back seat, I was approached by a stranger. It was a woman, and she had her arms full of a stuffed bear. So I knew right away that she was a mom like me. And she spoke to me in a voice with a very heavy accent, so I knew English was not her first language. She explained that she just missed the bus there in front of the mall, and she wondered if I would be willing to take her up to the university where she could get the bus later in its route. I said, "Yes, get in." So she got in the front seat beside me. I said to Elizabeth, "We're going to take this lady up to catch a bus on Franklin Street, then we'll go home." "Okay, Mom," she said, though Elizabeth doesn't like surprises. We drove the woman to her destination and let her out. Coming back home, I thought I should give some context to what had happened. I'd never picked up a stranger and put them in the car, certainly not with my daughter available in the back seat to watch and witness. So I said, "Well, Elizabeth, I guess I just did my good deed for the day." She said, "Why do you have to do a good deed for the day, Mom?" I said, "Well, I think that's what makes the world go round." She said, "Oh." She thought for a minute. She said, "Some people wouldn't help another person with a different skin color or a different accent." I said, that's right. She said, and then the world stops. I said, yeah. She thought for another minute and she said, then when it starts again, you need to keep jumping over that person every time you get to them. I said, wow, Elizabeth. And after a moment, she said, then after a while, you have to jump really hard because it gets to be all of us. I said, Elizabeth, you're a philosopher. She said, what's that, Mom? And we drove up the driveway and we're home. Thank you for listening.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, thank you, Milbre. Wow. What three wonderful stories, really. How did you come to bring these stories together?
Jim, I actually began to put these stories together shortly after 9/11. As a mother and an artist, it was important for me to look for stories about reconciliation and peace and justice, and to include some stories from some of the cultures that were really being targeted at that time. And so I put together first a workshop, then a concert, and finally an album of these stories. And it's called Making the Heart Whole Again, Stories for a Wounded World. And it was nominated for a Grammy when it came out.
Oh, boy. Yeah. Wow.
So,
Well, there's, both a real soul and a real artistry to them. So I really very much appreciate you sharing them with us. Yeah.
very kind of you.
Well, folks, if you had any wonders about why we're doing this work, I think you've just seen a good example. Let's see now. I'm going to, and we do this every week. We do this every day, every weekday of every week. And we invite storytellers to come and tell their stories and help us all just go to a better place in terms of healing and reconciliation. And how we do that? We do that with simple questions and simple answers and heartfelt communication. So please join us on the Facebook page where you're watching this now. If you're doing that, the stories are archived there, the Transformational Storytelling. Come to the YouTube playlist where you can see them all there. But share them with your friends, please, please, please. But more importantly, open your hearts and speak to each other. And that's how we get to a good place. Thanks again.